Hello, this is Dr. Jenkins, and here we are for our next chapter on the lymphatic system. And what goes along with that, of course, is the immune system. This is one of my favorite cartoons, so I'm going to pause a little bit so you can check it out. I'm of a certain age that when I was younger, my mother had no problem bending me over her knee and using the old-fashioned rectal thermometer. But maybe she just liked to torture me, I don't know. It is the most accurate, I will say that. Okay, so this is a logical next step. And, the lymphatic system sometimes doesn't get enough credit. People don't talk about it that much. People don't necessarily understand what it does. But it's just as important, really, as any other system. It's just not as sexy as the cardiovascular system, where we can imagine the heart, it's pumping, and it's so cool. But indeed, wherever we have an artery and a vein, traveling right beside it is a lymphatic vessel. So if we have the arteries, which would show up as red, of course, if we have the veins that show up as blue, usually the color that is denoted for lymphatic is green in diagrams. So we have bundles of arteries, veins, and lymphatics. As a matter of fact, we do have some nerves that run alongside there too. So we have this big bundle of goodness. But lymphatic system is right there, right alongside the arteries and veins. So that's why it comes after the cardiovascular system. And then something that people may not realize is that the immune system is working hand in hand with the lymphatic system. All right, so that's why we're going to discuss them together. Okay. So here's what I said before. We're going to start with the lymphatic system, and I'm sorry about that pop-up. Let's just ignore it. Please bear with me. Thank you. The lymphatic system doesn't get much love. It's kind of not sexy, but it's really important, just as important as the others. All right, so if we look at this picture, I'm going to zoom in just for a moment. This is kind of a map of the lymphatic vessels, and they show up as green usually on diagrams. And you can see that these lymphatic vessels travel all through the body, just like arteries and veins do. So what is the lymphatic system? Well, the lymphatic system is a series of vessels that run alongside the blood vessels. And what do these vessels do? They pick up or recover excess fluid. I guess that sounds kind of vague. And we're going to get more specific here in a moment, but just imagine, we have fluid that accumulates in the body. Fluid that is a byproduct of chemical reactions, fluid that is collecting in the tissues, and some of that fluid, in fact, most of that fluid is going to go back into the veins, right? And go back to the heart to be pumped out, to be incorporated back as the blood. So most of this excess fluid gets picked up by the veins, becomes part of the blood again, and boom, there we go. But whatever the veins can't pick up, the lymphatic vessels pick up. And it's really important. It's not as much as the capillaries pick up. The capillaries will usually pick up about 85% of our excess fluid, but that remaining 15% goes into our lymphatic vessels. Okay, so they pick up or they recover this excess fluid at the tissues that is accumulated. And then what's going to happen is that lymphatic fluid is going to travel up these lymphatic vessels back towards the heart. And what we're going to find is that these lymphatic vessels are structured and function much similarly to veins. So don't veins bring fluid from the body back to the heart? Indeed. Okay, so, and these steps over here on the left are happening in order. So we said number 1, the lymphatic vessels will pick up excess fluid, and then that fluid will travel back towards the heart. And as it's traveling back through the heart, the lymphatic system is able to inspect it. So not only is this a system that allows us to pick up excess fluid, it allows us to inspect it. And the beautiful thing about that is, if there's something foreign, if there's a bacteria or a virus, the lymphatic system will notice that and it will activate the immune system. I was saying that this system works hand in hand with the immune system, and here's how. As that excess fluid travels back up towards the heart, it gets filtered by lymph nodes. And when a lymph node notices, oh my God, bacteria, it activates the immune system. Immune system activates, boom, takes care of it. Whatever is left that gets back towards the heart, excuse me, whatever is left is going to dump back into the bloodstream. It's actually going to dump back into the subclavian veins, which are these veins very close to the heart. If you can understand this, you basically have the lymphatic system down. Again, no one talks about it. It kind of goes on doing its thing. It's kind of like it's kind of like the trash service, I suppose. It's picking up this excess fluid that no one really cares about. But when something goes wrong, if the trash isn't picked up every week and it accumulates, well, then we notice. Just like in the body. If the lymphatic system isn't doing its job and that lymphatic fluid accumulates, we definitely notice. And it's really problematic. All right, so this is what I said already. We just have it in these steps to make sure we're clear. So in order, at the tissue level, these lymphatic vessels pick up excess fluid that the capillaries didn't pick up. In case you're wondering, about 85% of that excess fluid is able to be picked up by the capillaries. Again, I'm sorry for that pop-up. Which means that the lymphatic system is picking up about 15% of that remaining fluid. It may not seem like a lot, but over the course of a day, we're talking in terms of liters. And then, as the excess fluid is traveling back towards the heart through these lymphatic vessels, lymph nodes will inspect it, they'll filter it. The lymph nodes in this picture are these little nodules. There's a couple right there, right? Here's some. And then if those lymph nodes notice or identify a bacteria or virus, they will activate the immune system. Help! Whatever is left is going to return back into the, let me put veins close to the heart. But not much is left, because what happens is most of that fluid along the way gets filtered out. So there's really not much at all that's going to return into the veins close to the heart. So whatever fluid, but it's not much. Because most of it is filtered out in the lymph nodes. Hopefully I'm demystifying something that you've always wondered about. Probably not here, but this system is really important. Okay, so I list the functions again. These are the same ones we just talked about. Sometimes people like to see them in a different way. So here's another review of how they work. Okay, so let's get into the anatomy of the lymphatic system. What are the structural components? We have the lymphatic fluid, we have the vessels, We have specialized lymphatic cells, we have some lymphatic organs, and those lymph nodes. Let's go one by one. That lymphatic fluid is called lymph. You might see it called lymphatic fluid. Either way. So the fluid that is actually picked up at the tissues is very close to our blood plasma. So it's mostly water. Of course, it's going to have some things dissolved in it, but the fluid that we're picking up at the tissues that becomes known as lymphatic fluid, once it enters a lymphatic vessel, it's mostly like plasma. It's mostly water. These lymphatic vessels, folks, are pretty much just like veins. And because we just talked about veins, we already understand what veins look like. They're thin-walled, they contain valves to prevent backflow. So they're just like veins. They're thin-walled, they're pretty wide in diameter, and they are transporting fluid towards the heart, back up. And just like veins, we talked about this, the primary mechanism for how we pump that lymphatic fluid back up towards the heart is the skeletal muscle pump. So we said that veins, so if we go back to our discussion of veins are trying to send blood back up towards the heart, right? And these veins are surrounded by muscles, skeletal muscles. And what happens is when these muscles contract, they push against the vein, and that squeezes the blood up. And then when those muscles relax again, and they're not squeezing against the vessel, then the valve closes to prevent backflow. So it's the same thing for these lymphatic vessels. This picture is kind of weird here on the right, but we can imagine, we can imagine that there's muscles right alongside it, right? It's my muscle. And when the muscle contracts, it squeezes against the lymphatic vessel, and that will squirt some of the fluid up. And then when the muscles relax, then these valves close to prevent backflow. So that slow contraction, the muscles contract, squeezes the fluid up. Muscles relax, the valve closes to prevent backflow. So it very slowly squeezes fluid back up towards the heart. What I do want to point out, though, is lymphatic vessels have even lower pressure than veins. That means it's a little bit more difficult to push this fluid back up. It's difficult for both veins and lymphatic vessels because a lot of times we're trying to push against gravity, especially from the lower extremity, right? So it's difficult to pump this fluid back up against gravity. We don't have the benefit of the heart, right, attached to it on one end, like the arteries do. However, if someone is contracting their muscles, if they're walking around, if they're active, then it's really no problem. But you can see what inactivity does. If someone is less active or sedentary, or God forbid someone is bedbound because of illness, or maybe someone who's so overweight that they're bedbound, this is why it's so dangerous for them, because they're not contracting these muscles, which is making it much more difficult for this lymphatic fluid to get back up towards the heart. And if you don't contract these muscles enough, that means that the fluid is likely to collect and pool. Maybe you've heard of lymphedema. Okay, so make sure you know this part, that the pressure in lymphatic vessels is even lower than the pressure generated in veins. Excuse me, to blow my nose. I'm so sorry. So that means it's even harder. I'm not saying it's not possible, but it's even harder to pump this lymphatic fluid back up. Okay, so I give you fair warning if you want to look away. I've got a picture of a human cadaver because I think it shows how these vessels look reasonably well. So feel free to fast forward if you want, but it's pretty cool. So we're looking right kind of, it's called the femoral triangle, but it's right in this line right here. It's kind of near the crotch, I apologize. But we're going to see arteries. There's a big bundle of arteries, veins, and lymphatics. Let's label some of these. So this is an artery. Put it in red. Let's put in the vein. Where's the femoral vein? It's the big one right here. There's a vein. Let's add the lymphatic vessels. Here are some of the lymph nodes, and then the little vessels attached to them. So these lymph nodes are very small. Here's one, two. Here's some over here. So we see, there's another artery there. I'm sorry, I want to make sure I get this correct here. It's my anatomical sense. I got to get it right. There's another artery here. And we have veins too. I'll do the veins in black. I'm sorry, nerves. Where's the nerve? Here's a nerve, this spindly thing. So what do you see? Everywhere in the body we have these bundles. Arteries, veins, nerves, and lymphatics. It's pretty cool. Okay, so we've so far, I'm going to go back just for a second. We've so far talked about the lymphatic vessels. These are the vessels that we can see, right? That these green little things that go up. These green little things that go up. Well, microscopically, before we even get to those lymphatic vessels, right? So those lymphatic vessels are going to travel up, but at the tissues, we have some lymphatic capillaries. And this is how they can pick up excess fluid. So here we see the blood capillaries, right? We saw a capillary bed. Well, intermixed into the capillary bed are these green lymphatic capillaries. So remember I said that most of our excess fluid goes into the veins. So most of our excess fluid, let me use a different color because other areas are black. Most of the excess fluid goes into the veins. And then that fluid is going to travel back up that way. But some of that fluid is going to go back into the, what color can I use here? Let's use yellow. Some of that fluid, whatever the veins can't pick up, some of that fluid is going to go into the lymphatic vessels, which are denoted here as green. And whatever goes into the lymphatic vessels is going to continue up towards the heart in a lymphatic vessel. But you can see here we have the blood vessels and the lymphatic capillaries blending together. So a reminder down below here, the lymphatic capillaries pick up whatever the blood capillaries don't. You'll notice some differences between the blood capillaries and lymphatic capillaries. The green lymphatic capillaries are kind of dead-end streets at each end, whereas the capillary bed forms kind of a bed that's all connected. Okay, good. So remember I said that 15% isn't a whole lot? So I said about 85% of the fluid goes back into the veins, but the remaining 15% goes into the lymphatic capillaries. 15% may not seem like a lot, but over the course of a day, these lymphatic capillaries and vessels will reabsorb as much as 3 liters. I'd like you to have an idea of that number, because that's a lot. What would happen if this fluid is not picked up by the lymphatic capillaries? It would stay in the tissues, it would collect, and it would pool, and you would have lymphedema, right? Lymphedema is swelling in our tissues because of a dysfunction with the lymphatic vessels. Some people might mistake this as something called elephantiasis, but that's different. That's like a swelling caused by a tropical disease, so more likely to see in like the Caribbean or countries close to the equator, I suppose. But here, this is just a structural problem with our lymphatic vessels. And it tends to just get worse from there because over time, the lymphatic vessels can stretch out. And once they stretch out, they're not elastic. They're not going to be able to recoil. So it's a real problem. Okay, and remember, whatever fluid is left coming back up near the heart is going to return to the, I'm going to add this, return to the veins close to the heart, which of course leads into the heart, but it goes back into the bloodstream. There are 2 dumping sites. So all of these lymphatic vessels from everywhere in the body, from the legs, from the arms, from the neck, they're all going to dump into the veins very close to the heart. The blue veins, right? And we have 2 ducts. So we have 2 little entry points. And I'm going to zoom in a moment. But here's one. Sorry about that. And here's another. Everything from the left side of the body, all of the lymphatic vessels from the left side of the body drain into the thoracic duct. Everything from the right side drains into the right lymphatic duct. And remember, it would be right and left as it is on that person. Now, a little more specifically, as I said, the right side of the body is the right lymphatic duct, but it's only the upper body. It's kind of weird here. And honestly, I don't know the anatomical reason or the physiological reason why this is so. But from the right side of the chest, head, and right arm goes into the right lymphatic duct. Everything else from the entire lower body and left side of the arm and chest drains into the thoracic duct. But both of these ducts are draining into the vein very close to the heart. You should know these. All right, so what are some of the cells that are involved in the lymphatic system? We're not going to get specific. There are some specific cells, for example, macrophages, lymphocytes, reticular cells. You don't have to know these cells in particular. But what I do want to talk about would be our lymphatic organs. So in addition to the lymphatic vessels that transport lymphatic fluid back up towards the heart, in addition to the lymphatic capillaries at the tissues, we have some organs that play a role in the lymphatic system. Our lymphatic organs are, I'm just going to peek ahead for a second because I would rather, yes, okay. We're going to talk about this primary versus secondary more when we get to the immune system. So I got a little ahead of myself here. So all I want to say right now for the lymphatic system is I want to talk about these organs, lymph nodes and spleen. We're going to talk later about the other ones because this is how we get into how the lymphatic system works with the immune system. But right now, I just want to talk about the lymph nodes and the spleen. We're going to talk about that later. Lymph nodes. Let's talk about lymph nodes. Okay. So we already saw, as these lymphatic vessels bring fluid back up, every so often we'll see a cluster of lymph nodes. And they do cluster. There are in higher concentrations in certain areas. And I think you know this. They're in higher concentrations in the groin, the neck, and the axilla or the armpit. The job of these lymph nodes is to filter lymphatic fluid. So as that fluid travels back up towards the heart, there'll be a lymph node where it's filtered. Actually, a little cluster. And then whatever fluid is remaining will continue on its journey until it hits some more lymph nodes, where it gets filtered again. Whatever's left continues up its journey until it hits more lymph nodes. Whatever's left is going to return into the veins. So we can see that our lymphatic fluid is filtered over and over again. Here's what a lymph node looks like up close. We saw them just kind of looking like little balls, right? But up close, they're kind of cute. All right, you don't need to know specific anatomy. All I'm saying is the lymph nodes filter lymphatic fluid. If you've ever seen a physician, or anybody really, if someone's sick, they might feel around their neck. What they're feeling for are enlarged lymph nodes. Because when your body is fighting an illness, these lymph nodes are working overtime. And they might be inflamed. So a tender lymph node means that it's working overtime and that the body's trying to fight something. I said this, but I want to make sure it's written down here. The lymphatic fluid gets filtered over and over and over again. It travels from one lymph node to another, and that's why there isn't much fluid left by the time we get it back towards the heart. Okay, our other main lymphatic organ is the spleen, upper left quadrant. There it is. It's kind of cool. Here here's a cadaver picture. Hope you were ready. Here we've peeled back the liver. We've peeled back the stomach. We actually get a really good look at the pancreas. If you're interested, we can see the kidneys. We can see the aorta, the inferior vena cava. And there's the spleen. The spleen stores blood, but also filters lymphatic fluid. So here's another area where we see a lot of filtration of that lymphatic fluid. Okay, here are some slides to review. Okay, but what I want to do is I want to move into the immune system and fill in some of the gaps that we skipped over on some of those lymphatic slides. Okay, this is obviously a really big topic. We could spend forever. We are really, folks, only covering the absolute basics. All right? Only covering the absolute basics. All right. We are going to, this slide's really busy. Whew. Let me go to this slide instead. It's a good thing when I do this because I get to experience the slides as you do. And for example, that one was way too busy. So I need to do some editing. I prefer this slide. Maybe you do too. We're going to break down our immune system into these lines of defense. And this is, in a broad sense, how our immune system works, how it's trying to protect us. We know the function of our immune system, protection, right? If we see a foreign agent, bacteria, if we're fighting an illness, it's all about the immune system to try and get rid of that illness to protect us. So we're going to organize this in lines of defense. So we have our first line of defense of our immune system, and that's really our skin. I mean, what a great protectant. We have the skin that protects, is a barrier. It protects the inside of our body from the outside world, okay? If a bacteria or virus penetrates through our skin, then our immune system has a whole host of things that will attack it next. And these comprise our second line of defense. Now, if a bacteria or virus is able to get through our second line of defense, we only have one last weapon of our immune system at our disposal. And that's going to be our third line of defense, or our specific lymphocytes. So this is how we're going to talk about the immune system. Okay, that first line of defense, it's really our skin. What a great protectant, right? The skin is a great physical barrier. It's a mechanical physical barrier. We also include in our first line of defense the membranes that line our digestive and respiratory systems. In females, this would actually also include the vaginal tract. I mean, think about it. Think about your respiratory tract. Isn't that indirectly open to the exterior? Well, sure. I breathe in something from the outside. It enters my nose, goes into my pharynx, goes into my trachea, goes into my lungs. So even though my lungs are not directly exposed to the outside world, something from the outside world can absolutely get into my lungs. So our body has special membranes that line the lining of our digestive and respiratory tract because they are indirectly exposed to the outside world. So these are great physical barriers, but we also incorporate some chemical barriers within them. So it's not just physical. So for example, physical and chemical. For example, the oil of your skin. We have these oil glands called sebaceous glands, and they secrete oil, sebum, which helps to keep our skin a little bit pliable and soft. But that oil contains some antibacterial chemicals. So if a certain type of bacteria lands on our skin, the chemicals in our oil of our skin will kill it right then and there. So it's mostly a physical barrier, but there are also some chemical barriers, chemical properties that help protect us. Okay, this first line of defense, our skin, and then the membranes that line some of our respiratory and digestive tracts, right? Well, all of our respiratory digestive tracts. This first line of defense is considered non-specific. Non-specific means that it's the same defense against anything. It's the same defense no matter what type of bacteria or virus is trying to attack us. I mean, this makes sense. The skin, it's the same physical barrier no matter what. It doesn't matter if it's this bacteria or that bacteria, this virus or that virus. That just means that defense is non-specific. Same barrier, regardless of the attacker. Okay, so if something penetrates through our first line of defense, well then our immune system has a host of things that make up its second line of defense. There's many things that collectively make up our second line of defense. We're going to talk about white blood cells, our generic white blood cells, and we also have some proteins. We have some proteins that their job is only in the immune system. So these are two examples of ways that our immune system can fight bacteria or viruses in our second line of defense. So our white blood cells. I'm going to be a little bit more specific here. Our general white blood cells, like most specifically neutrophils. Not every white blood cells, just some. The neutrophils, these are our generic. I like that word better, generic. I knew I didn't want to say general, generic. These are our everyday white blood cells. We have the most neutrophils. They're our everyday standard stock Pac-Man blood vessel, right? They travel the bloodstream and they gobble up bad things through a process called phagocytosis, or cell eating. So our second line of defense, just imagine little Pac-Man people, little Pac-Man cells traveling around the bloodstream, gobbling up bacteria and viruses or anything that's foreign as a way to protect us. We also have some antimicrobial proteins, and these are a whole grouping of specialized proteins that help us to kill bad things. Again, I'm being really general here. Some examples of this would be there's a whole system of complement proteins. There's a set of antimicrobial proteins called interferons, okay? These are also, these generic white blood cells and these antimicrobial proteins are also considered non-specific. Just as a little caveat, for example, some of these antimicrobial proteins tend to be most effective against certain viruses, but it's not just one virus. So they're still considered non-specific because they may be most effective against a certain category of viruses, but they're still considered non-specific because they can kill many different viruses. All right. So we talked about those generic white blood cells. Our generic white blood cells are called neutrophils. Neutrophils will kill the bad thing through a process called phagocytosis. Just know that phagocytosis is basically cell eating. So if this whole purple thing is our neutrophil, the whole purple thing is the white blood cell, okay? It's going to come up to these bad guys. So these are the pathogens or debris. These are the bad guys. Well, the white blood cell comes up to the bad guys, surrounds it, brings the bad guys in, breaks them down, spits out the remnants. Phagocytosis. You don't need to know the specific steps, but just know the term phagocytosis. It is kind of like Pac-Man or Pac-Woman. This is how these generic white blood cells work that are part of our second line of defense. Here's an actual picture, which is pretty cool. The purple is a type of white blood cell I didn't talk about, really, called a macrophage. But macrophages do phagocytosis. And what's cool about macrophages is they have these sticky extensions that are able to catch the bacteria, bring them in, and then it's going to chew it up and spit it out. Here are some of the examples that I just talked about. You don't need to know these. I just wanted to give you some examples of these antimicrobial proteins. All you need to know is that they are a series of specialized proteins that function in the immune system. They are considered non-specific because they can fight against many different bacteria or viruses. If you're interested, here's some information about interferons and the complement proteins, but you don't need to know them. All right. Now, if something were to get through our first line of defense, the skin, well, then we would activate our second line of defense, the generic white blood cells and the antimicrobial proteins. But what if a bacteria or virus is able to survive those first two lines of defense. Then it happens. Then we have our third line of defense. These are our specific fighters. Our first two lines of defense were considered to be non-specific because they can fight against many types of bacteria or viruses. It's like the general troops. You send general troops out to war, the troops on the field will just pretty much kill whatever's in front of them, okay? Our third line of defense would be more like the sniper. This is my example, my analogy, and I think it's quite helpful. Hopefully it works for you. A sniper is more highly trained, and a sniper is designed to kill a specific bad guy, just like our third line of defense fighters are. The third line of defense are our B and T cells. Why is that's a typo? I'm so sorry. T. It should be T, not C. Where did I get C? So these are our B and T cells, our lymphocytes. These cells are specially trained to only target a specific virus, just like a sniper. It's more highly trained, and it is designed only to kill a specific bad guy. Doesn't kill just anything in its way. It's like a sniper. It's more highly trained, and it's designed to kill only a specific bad guy. So we're going to talk about our T cells and our B cells. I don't know where I got C. I'm so sorry. Again, a good reason for me to double check these. Maybe the T and the C are close to each other on the keyboard? Anyway, my apologies. Let's talk about the T cells. You've probably heard of T cells. T cells are the type of immune cell that is targeted in the HIV virus and the AIDS. So, people who have AIDS don't die from AIDS. They die from a common cold. Because the AIDS virus kills our T cells, that person no longer has this part of their immune system. And they're no longer able to fight against something that for most people, our immune system would take care of very easily. So our T cells make up most of our lymphocytes. So these are the more common fighters of our third line of defense. The T cells or T lymphocytes, they work more directly. Okay, and remember, these are specific fighters. Here's a introduction, little schematic of how the T cells work. It gets to be pretty specific. You don't need to know these steps, but basically, the T cell is more common and it works more directly. I would love to talk about this more, but I'm trying to be a little bit more general. Okay, then we have our B cells or our B lymphocytes of our third line of defense. These are less common, so this is going to make up about 20% of all of our lymphocytes. Remember, 80% of our lymphocytes were the T cells. They were more common. The less common are our B cells. These work a little bit more indirectly, and they're going to work through antibodies. You've probably heard of antibodies. When our body encounters something foreign, our immune system will create a specific antibody against it. This is an example of our third line of defense because it's a specific response to a specific thing. I give you an example here. Think about chickenpox. When a kid is first exposed to chickenpox, they get sick. But in the process of getting sick, their body is producing antibodies against the chickenpox. These antibodies have memory. And that means that if that same kid encounters the chickenpox virus years later, they probably won't get sick. Their body's still going to be fighting against it, But because they've already had it the first time, their body already has the antibodies for the chickenpox virus. So if they're exposed to it again, the antibodies are already there and they'll be able to kill it quickly, and the person likely won't even have any symptoms. That's an example of memory, that even years later, those antibodies can become active again to fight. This is a response that involves our B lymphocytes. It is specific because we form an antibody that is specific to a certain bacteria or virus. Okay. So what I want to do is, now that we've covered the basics of our first, second, and third line of defense, I'm going to go back to those slides that I skipped in the lymphatic system. So I'm gonna scan back here. I don't want you to get motion sickness here. So look away if you want. It gives me motion sickness. I wish I had a different way to go back, but I don't know of one in this program. So here we go. So now, I want to talk a little bit more about this. Let's see if I can erase this. Oh, I love this program. It's a wonderful thing. Okay. So these are our lymphatic and immune organs. Our lymphatic organs were specifically the lymph nodes and the spleen, but now we're incorporating everything. I mean, these systems do work together, so there's absolutely nothing wrong with combining these. So we're gonna separate our lymphatic and immune organs into primary and secondary. And I'm going to stick with this war troops analogy. So if we think of our primary lymphatic organs, this could be like a central fort, like Fort Knox, Fort Dix, you name a fort where someone who joins the military goes for training. And then we have our secondary lymphatic organs, which is where the troops go to fight. Let's bring this into the lymphatic and immune systems. The primary lymphatic and immune organs are the sites of our immune cell production, which really would be our white blood cells, right? And we're talking about both the generic white blood cells, the neutrophils, and our special fighters, the lymphocytes. So all white blood cells. So all of our blood cells, red and white as a matter of fact, but all of our blood cells are produced in the red bone marrow. Therefore, the red bone marrow is considered an organ of our lymphatic and immune systems. You may recall the red bone marrow is found in the ends of our long bones, for example, the ends of our humeruses and femurs. So this is where we produce the cells that will eventually go on to fight. Now you can see the thymus gland here. It's not in bold or starred, so you don't need to know it. But if you're wondering, the thymus gland is an endocrine gland directly above the heart. It's not the same as the thyroid. The thyroid is up in the neck, and the thyroid produces hormones that help regulate metabolism. But the thymus is lower, not in the throat, it's lower, it's right above the heart. The thymus gland, if you're wondering, is where some of these white blood cells go to finish their maturation. I'm going to put it in red because you don't need to know it. It's where our lymphocytes go to finish their maturation. Just like a training center for the snipers, right? Originally, the snipers go to the same training fort as the other white blood cells. So all the soldiers go to a fort where they're produced and trained, the red bone marrow. But then some, particularly those special fighters, the snipers, they need additional training or maturation. Same thing with our lymphocytes. They need more maturation to become the specific fighters that they are. And that's what the thymus gland does. Okay, so our white blood cells are produced in the red bone marrow. The red bone marrow is considered a primary lymphatic and immune organ. Then we have the secondary organs. This is where the cells they aren't produced here. This is where the cells are stored and where they do their fighting. Let me go back to the green here because I'd like you to know this. Let's go back to the green. So if we stay with the analogy, Fort Knox is where the troops are basically produced and trained, but then the secondary organs are where they go to do their fighting. And we already know where our lymphatic and immune cells go to do their fighting. Lymph nodes and spleen. Now, of course, the generic white blood cells, the neutrophils, they can do some of their fighting in the bloodstream. So I suppose we could classify the bloodstream as a location of fighting, but it's not a specific organ. So we'll stick to our lymph nodes and spleen. This is where those white blood cells go to do their fighting. All right. Here's more information. This is summarizing what we just talked about. Our red bone marrow is our primary lymphatic and immune organ. It is housed in the ends of the long bones. This is where we produce the white blood cells. The thymus gland, it is not starred, so you don't need to know it, but this is where our lymphocytes travel to mature. Our secondary lymphatic organs we already talked about. These are the lymph nodes spread out throughout the body. They filter lymphatic fluid and alert the immune system as needed. And then we talked about the spleen, another site that can filter lymphatic fluid and alert the immune system if needed. All right, so I am going to go back to the end. I apologize for the quickness of the moving slides here. We had some odds and ends, so we're almost done. And odds and ends here. Okay, I just want to talk about a fever. When the immune system is active, the body will, in many instances, cause a fever. The hypothalamus is the part of our brain that is responsible for our body temperature regulation. So a fever is a purposeful increase or a purposeful reset of the normal temp. The normal temperature is usually down here around 37 degrees Celsius. But when we're fighting an illness, your brain will purposely increase the core temperature of what's considered normal. Yeah. And the reason is because at a slightly higher temperature, bacteria can't reproduce as much. At a slightly higher body temperature, the enzymes work faster, and therefore the chemical reactions involved in our immune system happen faster. So a slight elevation in body temperature is actually useful. It limits bacteria's ability to reproduce. It helps our immune cells work faster. But of course, we don't want our core temp to be elevated too much because then we could see some cell damage. So it's all about being increased a little. And of course, we don't want it to be increased for too long, right? Okay, so there are many benefits of a fever. As I already said, bacteria can't reproduce as much. Enzymes can work faster. But we don't want the temperature to last too long or to be too high because it will actually damage the cells. It will cause them to denature, then they can't do their job, and they could die. All of our body processes will suffer. All right, I'm going to end, I think we're getting closer to the end here, talking about immunity, active and passive. Okay, and then we have artificial and natural. Okay. Okay, so these slides are again pretty busy, so I'm going to try and make sense of it. Let's first talk about active. So we have immunity that's considered active, and then we have immunity that's considered passive. Let's first define those two. we have active and passive. And you know what? I'm going to open up a new one here because I think this will help. Okay. So let's first talk about let me use black. Be easier to see, won't it? Sure. We have our active immunity and we have our passive immunity, okay? Active and passive. Going back here. Active is any immunity where the body itself produces antibodies. It is the body that produces antibodies. So in an active, the body produces antibodies. This was my example of the chickenpox virus. If you're exposed to the chickenpox virus, your body itself will produce the antibodies against it. The body is actively producing the antibodies. Versus passive immunity. In passive immunity, the body doesn't produce the antibodies. The antibodies are given from somewhere else. So in a passive immunity, the antibodies are delivered from outside, like in a vaccine. This can produce antibodies that are both effective, but one has memory and one doesn't, and that can influence their effectiveness. So, active immunity, the body itself produces antibodies. In passive immunity, the body still gets the antibodies. They're just given from an outside source. All right. Then we have two categories known as natural and artificial. And that's why I'm doing this other summary slide to help. Natural and artificial, right? So if we talked about active and passive, let's talk about, let me start a new one here. Okay, we have natural and artificial. Natural and artificial. Yes, okay. Hold on here. Let me collect my thoughts. Again, I think I need to edit these slides to make them a little bit clearer. We talked about active versus passive. Okay. All right. So remember, in active, the body produces the antibody itself, and there can be a natural active immunity. So let's just continue on this slide. So we'll do it in red. So we can have, I'm going to give you 4 examples of immunity. We're going to have a natural active. Natural active. An example of a natural active immunity was my chickenpox example. Okay, so the example of this would be natural exposure to a virus. And the example we're going to give is our chickenpox. So in a natural active immunity, your body produces the antibodies and it was exposed to the virus naturally. So natural, oops, sorry about that. Anytime we see the word natural, it means the body was exposed to a virus naturally, which just means that it got exposed from touching a door handle of that virus, or someone sneezed and it had the virus in their respiratory droplets and you were exposed to it naturally. So, in a natural active immunity, it's a natural exposure to a virus, and your body will produce the antibodies itself, right? I'm going to shorten antibodies to AB. Okay, that was our natural active. Then we have a passive way of producing, a passive way of being exposed. So we had a natural exposure, and then we can have a passive exposure. A passive exposure means that you were exposed to the virus artificially, like a vaccine. So you didn't just naturally come across it, you purposely were exposed to the virus. Oh, I just touched something. I don't know what that little thing is. So our second example of immunity would be active immunity through a vaccine. Artificial, passive, active, passive. Let's do natural, active, and then I'm going to classify this as, if I say passive, it's going to be like active, passive, and that's a little confusing. So let's just say vaccine, active. And I'll use similar wording in our quizzes and exams. This would be like a vaccine. So it means that you were exposed to the virus artificially. That's what it should be, artificial. Yes, this is sometimes also called artificial. I apologize because sometimes in different classes we use different terms. So we're going to call this artificial active. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you for bearing with me. Sometimes I use different terms to try and make it easier for some classes, and it ends up just confusing me. Artificial. Artificial active is like a vaccine. You were exposed artificially, so artificial exposure, but still your body produces the antibodies itself. Okay, I think if you're able to give an example of each, it'll be helpful. So our natural active is like exposure to a chickenpox virus. You were exposed naturally, but your body still produces the antibodies itself. Artificial active would be like a vaccine, where your exposure was artificial, but your body still produced the antibodies itself. Okay, so I think this should actually be artificial. Time to update these slides, Dr. Jenkins. Oh, yes. Then we're going to have our two other examples of passive. So now we're going to go for our third and our fourth example of passive. Okay? One of them is going to be natural. One is going to be artificial. So we have our natural passive and our artificial passive. I have a slide that says these can be a little confusing, and you can see in my explanation of them they can be. So try and understand the basic definitions. Active, your body produces antibodies itself. Passive, the antibodies are delivered to you from an outside source. Natural versus artificial. Natural exposure, you're exposed to it naturally. Artificial exposure, you're exposed to it artificially. And then we combine them to have four examples. And these are the ones I want you to know. Natural active immunity would be like a chickenpox virus. You're exposed naturally. The body actively produces the antibodies. Artificial active, you're exposed to it artificially. So you're exposed to the virus through a vaccine, a small amount of the vaccine, in the vaccine, but that you still produce the antibodies actively. Now we're going to go to natural passive and artificial passive. So here the antibodies are delivered from outside the body. The body does not produce it itself. A natural example would be the passing of antibodies from mother to fetus. So our example here would be passing of antibodies from mother to fetus. It's a natural exposure. It's a natural exposure, and the antibodies will be delivered from outside. The antibodies are given from the mother to the fetus. And then we have our last one, artificial passive, which would be like an anti-venom. So let's say you get a snake bite. Well, you don't have time. You don't have time to wait until your body makes the own antibodies. So we better deliver those antibodies passively. Okay. So what I want to point out is in passive immunity, there is no memory. Okay? And that's the downside of passive. In passive, there is no memory. So if you get that anti-venom, well, what if you got bitten by the same snake 2 years later? You're going to need the anti-venom again because the body is not going to have those antibodies still. The only way that we have memory was the chickenpox way, if you produce them on your own. This is why a vaccine is effective for a long period of time. Because the body produced the antibodies on their own, there's memory. So if you get exposed to the same thing, no probs, because those antibodies are still in the body and they can become activated. So please focus on these examples, right? Chickenpox, vaccine, mother passing to fetus, then an anti-venom shot where you're purposely given the antibody because time is a factor. Also know that passive means do not have memory. Okay, there we go. Lastly, I wanted to talk about some immune system abnormalities. You need to know what's in red here. An allergy just tends to be a hypersensitivity, and the immune system just gets a little bit hypersensitive. I mentioned an example of an immune deficiency syndrome, HIV and AIDS. So it's not that the person dies from AIDS, it's that they die from an deficient immune system. The AIDS virus actually attacks the T lymphocytes, and their T cell count can be down in the single digits. So that really doesn't give much of a fighting chance at all, even against a common cold. And then there's an autoimmune disease. It's not immune deficiency, but it's an autoimmune where the body attacks itself. One of the best examples probably for that would be something like multiple sclerosis or even rheumatoid arthritis, where the body attacks its own joint. So in an autoimmune disease, the body is attacking something because it thinks that there's a problem, but there really isn't. So it's an immune response when there really doesn't need to be one, but that immune response carries a whole host of side effects. Other information about autoimmune disorders, diseases, they're much more common in women. We don't know why. Someone who has one autoimmune disorder is more likely to have another, so sometimes they tend to happen in multiples, unfortunately. Okay. Lastly, remember, our immune system is always working. So it's not like we only activate our white blood cells when we're sick. Right now, hopefully you're not sick, but your white blood cells are still working because you're constantly being exposed to some bacteria and viruses. But we start to have symptoms. We start to actually feel sick when our immune system is not able to keep up, when we have more bacteria or viruses than we're able to keep up with. And the immune system has to work in overdrive, and as a result, we feel some of those symptoms. All right. Now we're done. Go wash your hands. Good job as always.